September's Bitesize webinar. As many of you might be aware, we did have a break last month, so it's been a little while since we last had one of these webinars, so it's nice to be back. Today's webinar is being hosted by the lovely guys from BAM FM, and I will be handing over to them very shortly, but I'm just going to have a very quick intro into the webinar series and who we are. So we are obviously the SFMI, the Sustainable Facilities Management Index. Our purpose is to embed sustainability into the management and operations of FM providers and the FM industry. We do this through our 4 key pillars. So we provide roadmaps for FM leaders within the industry. We come up with strategic solutions, and we like to celebrate and share successes as well, which is particularly where the bite-sized webinars come in. So today we've got our speakers from BAM FM. So we've got, as mentioned, we have Anthony and Craig joining us today. They are here to talk about how BAM are working with their clients to create and implement net zero plans. And they are kind of increasingly seeing, and so are we as well, seeing FMs increasingly seeing their clients with lots of ambition towards kind of setting and achieving net zero goals and targets. But often we're seeing that they have kind of flaws or misguided advice within their plans on how to achieve those. So they're just going to talk today about how they are working towards decarbonising existing buildings. But I won't talk too long, because obviously I will hand over to them now. So guys, you're more than welcome to crack on.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Sophie. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us. It's great to be here. Actually, come back. Actually, I think it's our second time we've done this, so it's we must have done okay in the first instance to be invited back. So I'll take that as a positive. Yes, we're BAM FM, part of the bigger BAM group of companies, and just a little bit of background, I suppose, before we start. Probably most of you know us, but we offer a full range of operation and maintenance services, as well as energy management and a low energy carbon solutions business as well, under the FM banner. And we've been partnering with Aclaro now for numerous years and participating in their SFMI audits. We're a gold business, and we've been a gold business for the last about 4 years, I think, but consistently getting better and creeping up towards platinum, which we're really, really proud of. I think just generally, as a bit of an intro, I think we've all seen this growth of awareness of carbon management and carbon awareness, well, just in society, I suppose, at large, and never before been as kind of relevant as with the energy crisis and things that's going on that you can read about in the news. We've seen lots and lots of footprinting, lots of measures, and lots of claims coming in, largely around sort of scopes 1 and 2, but it's understandable. That's the sort of most sophisticated part of the emissions reporting. But I think as we see this maturity under sort of an understanding get better, and people sort of delve a bit deeper, we're starting to see more and more people interested in scope 3 and their kind of indirect emissions and how that can affect their businesses. Actually probably the biggest impact of a lot of businesses will actually fall under scope 3, possibly up to maybe 80% of an impact. So what this sort of clamour for sort of carbon reductions results in really is about people asking us as an FM provider to kind of maybe support their ongoing development, and that's what we've seen, and that's what we've sort of been helping quite a few customers with recently. So that's where we're sort of at, and I'm going to pass you over now to one of our energy managers, Craig McDonald. Craig's going to talk about how we've been working with clients to help them with decarbonisation plans.
Hi there, everybody. I'll just try and share my screen, so just bear with me 1 second.
Sorry, just before you crack on, Craig, just to let everyone know, we do have the Q&A function open within this webinar today. So if you do have any questions as they go, please do put those into the Q&A function, preferably that function rather than the chat, just makes it a bit easier to collate them all together. And then we will have a short Q&A at the end of the presentation today. So if you've got any questions, please do submit them. And over to you, Craig.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi there, my name is Craig McDonald, and I'm an energy manager for BAM FM. I've been working in energy efficiency for probably about 15 years. Prior to joining BAM, I predominantly worked in the retail space, working for a couple of large retail clients as an energy manager. Joined BAM about 5 or 6 years ago, and my main function is to look after our PFI estate, which is a collection of buildings up and down the UK, educational facilities, constabularies, hospitals and offices, which we look after on behalf of local authority clients. I've been asked here today to talk about decarbonisation, the built environment, and maybe talk about our experience of not only trying to decarbonise in our own estate, but predominantly helping these local authority partners shape their decarbonisation or net zero plans, depending on their targets, and maybe some of the questions we've come up against, the pitfalls that we've found. I appreciate that people on this call will be coming from different businesses, organisation, industries, but hopefully there'll be enough commonalities within what we've found that you'll find something useful. So just to briefly go through the agenda, maybe just talk about the kind of first steps, what we'd ideally like to do, and ideally what hopefully you guys will get to do, either within your internal organisations or with external clients, and very important to help shape those targets and plans if you can. Then we'll maybe move on to the decarbonisation plan and how we would help set that, and maybe just talk about maybe mindset changes that we've noticed since carbon has become the target, moving away from the kind of more traditional metrics of consumption and cost, and then talk about how we would go about, or hopefully you would go about implementing that plan, sorry. And then what happens afterwards, how we can ensure that all the plans that you've developed are maintained and take you hopefully closer to that net zero goal. Okay, so really I think to begin with, and I appreciate it depends on who you're talking to, where you might already have a target in place, but let's just pretend that that's not the case. Ideally, when setting a carbon plan or a carbon target, it's really important, we think, to sit down and just have a pretty open and frank discussion with all the relevant stakeholders to what's possible, basically. This will depend on your building, your estate, what it's used for, where you are, your location, what's technologically possible, what's economically possible. Do you have finance? Will you have to think outside the box to get external finance, or maybe consider energy performance contracting or PPA measures, etc.? And then sit down and have a chat about what are the main drivers for decarbonisation within yours or a third-party organisation. Traditionally, we always worked in the past looking at consumption-based targets or cost-based targets, where you are looking usually quite short-term, reduce by 5% in 1 year, 25% in 3 years, stabilising cost, reducing cost, etc. But now with carbon and net zero as a target, we're usually talking a lot longer term now. And the way we think about those targets really has to change the kind of mindset on how operationally you deliver those. As is always important with any target setting, it's really key to understand where you are now. And that's not only in terms of consumption, and we've only, Anthony touched upon scope 3 here. My bread and butter is scope 1 and scope 2. So not only the consumption within your existing estate, but also have an understanding of what assets make up those facilities, even if it's quite rudimentary, to give you a target list of projects that you can milestone in your hopeful journey to net zero, and then get a real understanding of how the buildings are used, because ultimately there's no point in having a net zero building if it's not fit for its intended purpose. We need to never veer away from these buildings are there to serve a purpose and serve the people that use those buildings. So we think it's a really important consideration in target setting and plan setting when you're identifying projects. So then moving on to the actual plan itself, hopefully if you had the chance to have those discussions and collect the data from the current estate, hopefully those discussions would help shape that plan. Traditionally, again, we would be looking at where you are now and setting interval targets for 1 year's time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time. With net zero or carbon neutrality and a longer term target, we think it's probably more beneficial to start at that end point and start working your way back. And hopefully with the information you've gathered, you probably know the key milestones that you'll have to address along the way. But rather than thinking of them individually, start to think of them a bit more holistically and how they work together along that journey backwards from your end goal. There's no point spending 80% of your time trying to go after low-hanging fruit, quick wins, and then the last 10-20% of your journey frantically trying to think of a way to do the harder things. You need to consider everything from day one, and as I say, start at that end point and work your way back. We've simplified this a little bit for the purpose of the webinar today, but essentially you've probably got 3 main routes to help you get to that net zero point, and that would be reducing demand, generating on site, hopefully if possible, and then the big problem that everybody's going to have that's going to be common to most buildings in the existing estate will be, what do you do with heat? So taking each step in turn,
Craig,
again,
slides moved on. I don't know if you've got another screen. There might be some slide. I think we're looking at the PowerPoint slide. Maybe just swap screens. That's it. Yeah.
That's it. Sorry about that. Sorry. So looking at each, it's got a vehicle in turn. If you think about efficiency, again, it would be, or certainly it has been for me and the colleagues that I work with, it's definitely a change of mindset. So going back 10 years, 15 years, energy efficiency, you were always looking at returns of investment, quick wins, return on capital. So if we look at maybe a technology that will be common to all buildings, lighting, for example, the quickest way to reduce consumption, and usually the most cost effective, would be to take down an existing fluorescent light fitting and put a new light fitting up there, whatever that new technology would be, if it was T8 to T5 or now T5 to LED, or even first iteration LED to the most modern LED. And that's great. You might have 100 lights, you reduce your consumption automatically by 10%, 20%, 50%, whatever that transition would be. However, if we're looking at net zero, ultimately we're trying to get that lighting consumption down to zero, which is obviously impossible, but we want to get as close to that as possible. So rather than look at these projects as what's the quickest way we could get a return on investment, we need to think a little bit more outside the box. So rather than just taking 100 lights down and putting 100 lights up, could we rationalize that light? Could we redesign? The new light fittings were going to be a higher output than what's currently there, especially if the existing technology is 5 years, 10 years, 15 years old, and if you're lucky, the output's maybe at 30, 40, 50% of the original design. And suddenly, rather than having 100 lights, we could maybe only have 75 lights, for example. At the same time, could we use that lighting more efficiently? And could we install some control? You might have rudimentary PIRs that might be useful for small spaces like toilets and offices, but when you have large spaces, open plan offices, a good example, then in most cases that just isn't enough. Even if you've got a very small amount of activity, you tend to find that the lights are on more often than not. Could you introduce daylight harvesting? Could you introduce light fittings that have individual sensors and move towards only illuminating the areas of that building that are actually being used at that time? And that's maybe how you get from 100% down to maybe only 25, 30% of the original consumption used. Okay, that will impact your return on investment. No longer would you be able to see a return in maybe 2 or 3 years. You might be looking at 6, 7, 8 years. But if your target is to get to net zero, you need to be thinking of the most efficient use of that technology and the most efficient use of that asset. If we look to generation, this will fully depend on where your building, your estate is. If you're in a city centre location, a rural location, etc., on how feasible this is to generate your own power. But typically, if we assume that we had some external space in the UK, you would be looking at PV or wind, with PV being the most likely avenue to explore for most sites. Again, traditionally, looking at a PV project as an energy manager, looking at return on investment, you'd be looking to size that PV system to the building load and try and reduce the amount of generation that would be fed back into the grid. If your target is net zero, that's not the way to look at it going forward. Okay, if you oversize a project, the picture you can see here is a carport solution that we're currently installing in a project. That is massively oversized, going on the kind of traditional rules of thumb, and the utilization on site of that system is probably going to be as low as 50 or 60%. However, our client in this situation has a net zero target in place and they are planning for the future. So at the moment, they can only be utilising 50, 60%, but they have aspirations of electrifying heat. They have aspiration of installing battery technology, and they also have a net zero target, which means any kilowatt that they export to the grid is as clean an offset as you're ever going to get. So although economically, it might not make as much sense as sizing to the existing building load, from a carbon perspective, it makes total sense to that client in particular. Now, the last one, and the one that's given anybody in my profession the biggest headache, is what do you do with heat? Heat typically will probably account for anything between 50 and 75% of your current Scope 1 and 2 emissions combined. Depending on what your target is and when it's set for, if it's 2050, you might be inclined to sit and wait and see what happens. There's obviously things happening in terms of developing alternative fuels, and they're obviously looking at the decarbonisation of the gas network. However, if your target is a bit sooner, then probably the only avenue you've got open to you just now is the electrification of heat. And there's three main routes to that. Again, oversimplifying a little bit, but you've essentially got the direct electric heating, radiant electric heating, and then the heat pump. And the efficiency of each technology probably increases in that kind of order. Direct electric heating is 100% efficient, which sounds great, but with the current electricity prices, it can be a scary prospect to go down that route. Radiant heating tends to be slightly more efficient than direct electric kind of wet-based systems, because you're only heating the objects rather than the total space. But really, if you're looking at a net carbon solution, a low carbon solution, ultimately you want to be using the least amount of kilowatt hours going forward, which is pushing many of our clients down the heat pump route. And again, traditionally, we'd be looking at heat pumps. Most of our buildings are going to be currently built, and they're designed to require flows, hot water flows between 50 degrees and 80 degrees. They might have large hot water requirements requiring water at 60 and 65 degrees. And we've all been told that heat pumps do not produce water temperatures of that size. Now, that's just not true. Heat pumps can provide water at whatever temperature you require. However, the hotter you need that water to be, then the less efficient they become. So a decision probably has to be made on whether you spend time. And this again will depend on when your target is set for. As your target in 5 years' time, you don't have the time to thermally improve the building, change all the heat emitters, replace all the air handling unit batteries to run a heat pump at its most optimum efficiency. If your target is in 2050, maybe you take the fabric first approach, then you move to the heat emitters, and you could potentially build up towards getting the most efficient system in there. But with our clients that have more stricter time frames, that we're actually considering putting heat pumps in just now that will provide 70, 75 degrees, and we're accepting that their efficiency might only be 200% compared to 400, 500, 600% efficient plants if you can do all that preparatory work. The idea being that over the short term, they will be coupling it with the energy efficiency, energy demand reduction elsewhere, and over generating local power, usually in the form of PV, that will reduce the impact cost of that drop in efficiency. At the same time, they're also considering technology like battery technology to harness power at cheaper rates during the day, that they can then utilise to run their heat pumps during the day to, again, lessen the impact of that efficiency drop. So ultimately, what we would maybe advise here is look to when is your target, basically, and then, as we said at the beginning, maybe set those milestones in the sand. Do you want to have that technology and learn about it on the go, or do you want to do some more preparatory work to make sure that when you get that technology in, it will be the most efficient use of that system when installed? Has that moved on? Sorry, Anthony. Yeah.
Yes, it has, mate. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, so once we've implemented, hopefully, your plan, as we discussed there, what would be the next steps? Again, it's kind of energy management 101, but we think it's really, really important to have an effective monitoring and verification system out there. Doesn't have to be particularly complex, depending on your particular requirements, but you have to have some way of verifying that all the work that you've done has been successful. Not only on day one, it's important to recognise that any asset replacement, any project work will degrade over time. LED lights will get less efficient, once they pass the kind of magic 50,000 hour mark, solar PV after years 2 and 3 will degrade in the generation capacity by 1-2% every year as they get towards the end of their useful life. Also, PV again, are you monitoring whether the systems need cleaned, etc., etc. And what you want to make sure is that the asset degradation slope that will occur, you can't avoid it. It doesn't get too steep, because ultimately the steeper that gets leaves you a larger gap between where you are and where you need to be. At the same time, when you're implementing any plan or installing any project work, it's really important to consider the future use of the facilities. We've included a picture here of a recent install of some car chargers by our team within BAM. Although we're talking about Scope 1 and Scope 2 today, if you're talking about carbon targets, Scope 3 will probably be on the agenda, and one of your Scope 3 targets is probably going to be the electrification of your vehicle fleet. Hopefully, with all this good work that we've done, reducing demand and increased generation, there's hopefully going to be enough spare capacity on site. But is there enough resilience within the building and the project scope so far that could be extended further? Because ultimately you're going to be adding additional demand to the site that you probably don't have at this moment in time. Also, is there any plans to extend the site? Is there any plans to have additional workers, additional staff members, etc.? Or is there likely to be any changes of the how the facility is occupied, changes of working practices, times? Is it going to go 24 hours where it's only 8 to 5 just now? If there's a chance of any of that, then that just strengthens the need for effective use of controls, as we spoke before, to ensure that you can segregate areas of the building and only use what you need to use when the building is occupied. And then finally, and we'll touch upon this in the last slide, is no matter how good your plans are, no matter how much you invest in the site, no matter how successful this net zero project, this net zero carbon plan, the decarbonisation plan has been, the chances are most buildings in the UK will still have a residual carbon footprint. So you want to be considering how you could potentially offset this carbon. What is important to your company? Is it to support local carbon accreditation schemes? Maybe you could get involved if it's some sort of charity organisation, complete some nice circularity, volunteer with them, etc. Or are you happy to utilise credits from abroad? But ultimately, as more and more businesses, organisations are utilising offsetting carbon credits, there's going to be a supply and demand risk. And you may find when you're getting to that stage, the type of credits and the quality of credits that you were hoping to get might not be there. So it's good to maybe plan in advance for that potential. The very last slide I just want to share with you is actually the visual representation of a decarbonisation plan that we've built for one of our local authority partners. Now, this facility is a healthcare facility which is used 24 hours a day, and as you can imagine, has got quite high heating and hot water demands. So it's maybe not truly representative of a generic building, but the basic principles will ring true. So as we went through before, we looked at the potential for demand reduction in energy efficiency, the potential for on-site renewables, and then the impact of the electrification of heat. You can see the demand reduction potential of the current kind of business as usual activity. There's about 550 tonnes of carbon That was back in 2021. We have identified demand reduction programs that will reduce that by about a tenth. That was not an insignificant amount of projects. It was in the 7 figures for a site that before the current crisis probably only used about £250,000 worth of energy a year. So a significant investment in demand reduction. At the same time, we identified the carport solution, the picture that I showed you earlier on, to cover the entire car park. Again, despite a significant investment, again in the 7 figures, that was only reducing the carbon footprint by another 10, 15, 20%, of which some of it we were going to recapture as export offset, as you can see there. The next stage in our plan is the electrification of heat. And you can see that that has a huge impact on this particular facility. We're quite lucky where this facility is that we've got the potential to utilise ground source heat, which massively increases the potential effectiveness of the heat pumps that we have earmarked for the facility. And again, that's a particularly significant investment to install that. And you can see even with all this potential investment behind, there's still a relatively significant offset at the end of it that the trust is going to have to consider, unless they can offset through other sites, generation sources nearby. And as a result, we are currently speaking to them about what the potential options would be in carbon credits and offsets to plug that gap, essentially, at the end. So that kind of brings to the end of my presentation. As I say, I appreciate that your organisation, your business might work in slightly different sectors, they might work in slightly different ways, but as I said before, hopefully there'll be some commonalities and some generic threads that will ring true within your organisation as well. So I don't know if we've got any questions at that point. Or
thank you very much. Yes, so I was just about to say we'll quickly finish up with a couple of well, I think we'll just have one question just to finish with, and so if I just reshare my screen. And then I think there's the opportunity to, is that all sharing? Can you see that?
Yeah.
So yeah, and then we'll add in some additional questions possibly into our newsletter to kind of follow up with, just because I'm aware that we're running a bit tight on time. So if you were to give one kind of piece of advice to new organisations or FM organisations who are new in their own sustainability journey and looking to decarbonise their own kind of existing buildings, what would you say would be the first 3 things that they should tackle within their own journey?
Yeah, it would just be to maybe reiterate some of the points of the presentation. It would be to understand where they are, understand where they would like to get to, and then have that discussion on what's possible. And if they don't have that resource in-house, it would be to speak to someone who did have that experience to help them shape that plan. So it would be, yeah, gather where they are, work out what their aspiration is, and then work with someone to develop the plan with them if they're not capable of doing it themselves, I think.
And don't wait too long to actually.
Yes, don't wait too long.
It seems a long way away, doesn't it? But it'll come around very quickly, particularly if anybody's got any interim targets at 2030, which is really kind of creeping up fast.
Definitely.
Okay, fab. Thank you very much. So just to summarise then, so for what's coming up next within the SFMI. So this month and next month, as many of you may be aware, we are running our annual audits. So many of you will be having your audits coming up. Some of you may have already had them, as those will be continuing till the end of October. And then we've also got our Scope 3 Stage 2 kicking off this month as well. And then we've now confirmed our date for the SFMI 2022 awards, which will be the 29th of November, which is a Tuesday, and it will be in the morning. So we will be shortly setting up the Zoom event for that and sending out details and invites for that as well. So keep your eyes peeled. I think there was maybe one or two other questions which we didn't have time for today, which I will get a kind of written response from Anthony and Craig, and so look out for that in our September newsletter as well, because we'll include those in there. But thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you, Anthony and Craig, as well, for joining us, and I hope you all have a lovely day, and hopefully we'll see you in next month's webinar.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.